The land kept its own counsel there, long before anyone tried to name it, and it did not give answers quickly. A river bent through the valley with the patience of something that had already outlasted every question asked of it. Its banks pressed flat by seasons of melt and drought, carrying silt the color of old bone. Cottonwoods lined the water, their leaves turning their pale sides when the wind moved through, flashing like small signals that meant nothing to anyone watching. Beyond them, the ground lifted into grassland, not wide and proud, but worn thin by hooves and feet that had passed without ceremony. A trail cut across the rise, shallow and uncertain, as if it did not wish to be remembered. And further on, the land broke into low stone ridges where sound traveled strangely, arriving late, or not at all. That evening, the sky sat heavy, neither clear nor promising rain, holding a dull sheen like metal left out overnight. Birds quieted earlier than usual, folding themselves into the brush, and insects tested the air, then stopped, as if something unseen had crossed their path. The river kept moving, but slower, dragging branches and grass in its current, circling them once before letting them go. Smoke from distant cooking fires lay close to the ground, unable to rise, spreading instead across the flats and sinking into the hollows. Nothing in the valley announced danger, yet nothing offered comfort. The grass leaned as though listening. Stones held the warmth of the day longer than expected, then cooled all at once. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and did not repeat itself. The land had seen nights like this before, nights where sound chose carefully, and light failed to travel far. It remembered camps pitched and struck without trace, remembered feet that moved quietly, and others that did not, remembered waiting more than action. When darkness settled, it did not fall cleanly but gathered in layers, pooling under trees, clinging to the low places, leaving the higher ground exposed and pale. The moon rose thin and cautious, showing outlines but withholding detail, turning the river into a broken line of light. Wind slid down from the ridges, carrying the smell of sage and damp earth, then shifted away again, restless. Fences creaked where wire had been pulled too tight years earlier, posts leaning under their own age, marking claims that the soil itself did not recognize. An abandoned wagon track filled slowly with shadow. No, its ruts softened by grass that had learned to survive being pressed flat. Even the stars seemed fewer, dulled by the thickness of the air, as if they had stepped back to let the ground speak first. In that stillness, the land did what it always did when people were about to choose something it could not stop. It held the shapes, kept the paths open, and waited, knowing that by morning it would be asked to remember what had passed across it in silence, and waited, knowing that by morning it would be asked to remember what had passed across it in silence. Dew settled unevenly, beating on grass near the water, while higher ground stayed dry, as if even moisture chose sides. A single tree near the bend shed a branch without sound, the wood already hollowed by years of weather. Somewhere beneath the soil, insects moved slowly, undisturbed, the continuing work that did not depend on human outcome. The valley did not lean toward mercy or harm. It held both without distinction. Paths remained open, not because they welcomed passage, but because closing them would have required effort the land no longer made. Darkness deepened in pockets, leaving other places exposed, unhidden, unprotected. Nothing shifted quickly, nothing hurried to arrive. The land waited in the way it always had, not with intention, but with memory already prepared. The widow was seen most often at the edges of things, never where voices gathered or questions lingered. She walked the same narrow line between river and cottonwoods each morning, her steps even, unhurried, as if she were counting without numbers. People in the valley knew her by shape more than by name. A dark dress that did not change with season, a shawl worn thin at the fold of the shoulders, hair kept back and plain. When she passed the trading place, men lowered their eyes out of habit rather than respect, unsure what a look might invite. She did not linger. She exchanged goods quickly, her hands sure, her words few and exact, then moved on before conversation could take root. Children noticed her more than adults did, perhaps because she did not try to notice them in return. She neither smiled nor warned them off, and so they watched her the way they watched weather. At her house, she kept the door latched but not barred, a signal that meant little and was understood anyway. Smoke rose from her chimney at regular hours, never thick, never absent, as steady as her own presence. She tended a small plot behind the house, bending carefully, her knees stiff, the soil dark beneath her fingers. Neighbors would have said she was capable, though they could not have named what she was capable of. Her husband was spoken of rarely now, not because he had been forgotten, but because his absence had settled into the valley like an accepted feature of the land. She had not remarried, had not taken in boarders, had not moved closer to town. When asked why, she answered with a nod or a brief sound that ended the question without offense. In the evenings, she sat on her step and looked toward the water without expectation, as if watching something that had already happened. Her face, when seen clearly, gave little away. Grief had smoothed it, rather than marked it, leaving no sharp lines for others to read. There were stories about her, quiet ones, traded without urgency. That she had once been lively, that she could sing, that she knew how to ride hard if needed. None of these stories were confirmed or denied. She did nothing to encourage memory, and nothing to stop it. The land seemed to accept her this way, allowing her passage without comment. Animals crossed her path without startle. Dogs barked once, then settled. Even strangers passing through felt no reason to ask after her, sensing she belonged to the place in a way that did not require explanation. She carried herself as someone who had learned the cost of attention and decided against it, moving through her days with care, leaving no clear mark beyond the simple fact that she was there, and that she endured. The choice came to her without ceremony, arriving the way weather does, already formed by the time it is noticed. She understood it first as a tightening, a narrowing of what had seemed wide enough moments before. Knowledge had gathered through the day in small, ordinary ways, none of them enough on their own to demand action, all of them together impossible to set aside. Tracks pressed deeper than they should have been for that stretch of ground. A length of brush broken where no cattle grazed. Smoke held low and traveled sideways instead of lifting, as if it wished to remain unseen. By late afternoon the valley felt altered, not changed outright, but adjusted, like a room where furniture has been moved in the dark. She moved through her tasks more slowly, not because she hesitated, but because each motion asked to be weighed. The lamp was cleaned earlier than usual. Water was carried twice. The door was checked, then checked again. These were not preparations for action so much as acknowledgments that action existed. As evening settled, the river took on a darker sheen, and the cottonwoods stilled, their leaves no longer turning their pale sides. She recognized the shape of the night forming, a night that would hold more than sleep. What she knew could be given away easily, passed on without name or explanation, and the knowing itself would leave her lighter. But what she knew could also be taken from her, turned into reason, accusation, or obligation. She had learned, over years, lived close to the edge of other people's decisions. That knowledge rarely travels alone. It brings questions, and questions bring attention, and attention carries its own risks. She stood at the boundary of her yard and felt the land pressing close, not urging her forward or back, only holding her where she was. The two paths before her were not equal. One offered the chance that movement elsewhere might be altered, that feet might turn away, that the night would pass with fewer traces. The other promised nothing except continuity, the preservation of her own stillness, the keeping of her days as they had been. Neither path could be walked without cost, and neither would reveal its cost in advance. She did not think of consequence in terms of right or wrong, only in terms of weight. Which burden would she carry more easily when time stretched it thin? She considered the men who rode for reasons they did not examine, and the people who moved quietly because being seen had never favored them. She considered how often silence had served as shield, and how often it had been mistaken for consent. The lamp sat ready, wick trimmed, oil clean. Outside, a faint glimmer appeared near the bend, then was gone, as if tested rather than offered. Her body responded before her thoughts finished forming, breath shallow, hands still. In that moment the choice did not feel dramatic. It felt small, contained, almost private. She remained where she was, letting the light inside her house stay low, letting the dark beyond remain unbroken. The decision settled without sound, not as relief, but as something closed. She did not tell herself a story about why. She did not promise herself forgiveness later. She only accepted that this was the shape the night would take, and that by morning the land would hold whatever marks resulted, whether she wished it or not. Time did not move cleanly after that, but spread itself thin, stretching each hour until it felt longer than the last. The night held, refusing to resolve into anything that could be named, and the valley seemed to settle into a listening posture. She kept to her house, not sleeping, not fully waking, moving between chair and window, as though pacing would invite notice. Outside, familiar sounds altered slightly, enough to be felt rather than heard. The river continued its work, but its rhythm seemed uneven, catching and releasing in irregular measures. Wind passed once through the cottonwoods, then did not return, leaving the leaves fixed and dull. She waited without marking the waiting. No candle burned down to count the hours. No prayer offered to divide the dark. Her body learned the shape of stillness, muscles tightening, then easing, then tightening again, as if adjusting to a posture meant to be held a long time. From time to time she thought she heard movement beyond the fence line, but each sound dissolved before it could confirm itself. Waiting did not bring clarity. It only made space. She noticed small changes that would have meant nothing on another night. The way the stove cooled more slowly. The way the floorboards responded to her steps with softer complaint. The way her own breath sounded louder than it should. She did not rehearse what she might say if someone came to the door. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. The night did not ask for explanation, only patience. At some point, clouds drifted across the moon, erasing even the thin light that had outlined the river earlier, and the valley sank deeper into itself. She sat with her hands folded, not in prayer, but in containment, keeping motion from turning into decision. Waiting took on weight, pressing inward, making her aware of the cost of remaining unchanged. Outside, hours passed without announcement. No rider crossed close enough to be counted. No call carried from one bank to the other. The world did not collapse, but it did not reassure. In the deepest part of the night, she felt something shift. Not sharply, but enough to be sensed, like pressure easing or tightening somewhere beyond her sight. She did not know if it was movement or only the suggestion of it. Waiting did not grant her that knowledge. It only insisted that she remain present while the night worked on other lives. Toward dawn, the air cooled further, and a faint dampness crept in, settling on the edges of things. She wrapped her shawl tighter and remained seated, resisting the urge to lie down, as though sleep might imply acceptance. The first bird called tentatively, then fell silent, uncertain. Waiting had changed the land, or perhaps only revealed how little control any single person had over it. By the time the sky began to pale, she understood that waiting was not neutral. It asked as much of her as action would have, asking her to endure the stretch of time without relief, to remain accountable to what she had withheld. When light finally began to return, it did not arrive as comfort. It came as continuation, showing that the night had passed, but not explaining what had passed with it. What came of the night did not arrive all at once, nor did it arrive where she could see it clearly. It reached her in fragments, carried by distance and omission, shaped by the way people spoke when they did not want to be responsible for what they were saying. By late morning, riders were moving along the upper trail, not fast, but with purpose, stopping where the ground showed signs of disturbance. She watched them from her doorway without stepping out, counting their number only once, then letting the count go. Dust rose where they passed, thin and pale, settling slowly, as if reluctant to mark anything permanently. Later, a man from downriver came by, not to her house, but close enough that she could hear his voice as he spoke to someone else, low and controlled. Words like camp and tracks carried, while the rest fell away. By afternoon, the valley had taken on a strained quiet, different from the night's listening stillness. This quiet was guarded. It held back information rather than waiting for it. Smoke rose in places where it usually did not, brief and uneven, as people cooked earlier or later than habit allowed. She went about her work carefully, tending to what needed tending, refusing to let her hands shake even when her thoughts did. Near the river, she saw signs that could not be dismissed. Grass, pressed flat in a wide circle, ashes scattered rather than gathered, a scrap of cloth caught in brush, its edge darkened. She did not touch it. She did not need to. The land was already speaking, though it spoke without accusation. By evening, it was known that some had fled and some had not, and that those who had not were no longer where they had been, and no names were agreed upon, no numbers settled. What mattered to others was not what had happened, but how it might be explained. She felt the cost then, not as punishment, but as narrowing. Conversation shifted when she approached. Eyes measured her more carefully than before, not because they suspected her, but because they sensed proximity. She was close to where things had occurred, close enough to be included in the circle of implication without being addressed directly. The consequence of her silence was not isolation, but a subtle binding. She was tied to the event without having participated in it openly. That weight followed her through the days that came after. When a child asked a question that brushed too near the truth, an adult interrupted. When a rider passed her place at night, he slowed, then moved on. Nothing dramatic unfolded. No reckoning arrived. Instead, the valley adjusted, absorbing loss the way it absorbed rain, unevenly, leaving some places soaked and others dry. She understood that her choice had not prevented harm, nor had it clearly caused it. What it had done was place her permanently on one side of an invisible line, a line drawn not by law or blood, but by memory. The land held that line quietly, keeping it intact even as seasons changed, even as grass grew back over disturbed ground. She lived with that knowledge as she lived with everything else, carrying it without display, knowing that some consequences do not seek acknowledgement, and that silence, once chosen, continues long after the moment that required it has passed. Years later, when the valley had taken on newer marks and old ones had been softened by time, the night was still spoken of, though never directly. It lived in pauses, in the way certain details were skipped when stories moved too close to that season. People said before and after, without naming what stood between. Children grew up hearing that there were places along the river where sound did not carry well, and they accepted this as a natural fact, the way they accepted that some ground stayed colder than the rest. The widow remained where she was, her house unchanged except for the slow wearing of its edges. Those who came to know her later did not hear the full shape of her life, only fragments that fit easily into conversation. They knew she was careful, that she did not waste, that she listened more than she spoke, or they knew she had outlived her husband and had not replaced him. What they did not know was how often she returned to that night without revisiting it, how memory could be present without being summoned. The land carried it openly. Each spring when the river ran high, she watched the water reach into the flats and withdraw again, leaving behind smoothness where there had once been disturbance. Each fall, when the grass thinned and the ground showed through, she noticed how certain paths never quite disappeared, even when no one used them. Travelers passed through who had no connection to what had happened, and they slept without unease, unaware of the layers beneath them. Sometimes, a small group of Lakota moved along the far side of the valley, keeping to themselves, their passage quiet and unremarked. She did not approach them, and they did not approach her. That distance held. It was not hostility. It was recognition of a boundary that did not require words. As she aged, her body slowed, but her habits did not change. She still rose early. She still kept her lamp low at night. When asked once why she never moved closer to town, she answered only that the land knew her. It was the closest she came to explanation. Toward the end, when her hands began to fail her, and another woman came to help with heavy work, the widow spoke a little more, though never about the night itself. Instead, she talked about weather that had turned without warning, about years when silence had saved a harvest, and years when it had not. These were not lessons, only observations offered without insistence. After her death, there was no ceremony worth noting. Her things were divided. Her house stood empty for a time, then was taken apart for its usable pieces. People said it was a shame, or they said nothing at all. The river continued to bend. Cottonwoods continued to shed leaves and grow them back. The place where the camp had been could no longer be pointed to with certainty. What remained was not a story with an ending, but a remembered shape, passed along without detail, held by the land and by those who lived near it. This is how it was remembered.